So this is a Mikuni carburetor, the VM24 that's commonly found in the old Royal Enfield 350cc bullets. Today we are just going to do a reassembly video on this carburetor and also talk about a few tips on what to look out for while reassembling the carburetor. One of the most common mistakes that people make while rebuilding the carburetors is not making sure that these passages that are there in the carburetor is not blocked. So if there's a blockage, you're going to have a fuel or air starvation, which is going to affect the circuits. So to begin with, we are going to install this, which is the emulsion tube. The emulsion tube has a keyway cut into it, and that keyway is supposed to line up with the flat section of this carburetor, which has a pin inside. So to install it, you have to slide this in the correct orientation and just give it a light tap with a brass drift or a punch and set it in place. So this is the emulsion tube that's been installed. As you can see, the keyway that's cut in here, the slot, lines up with the pin that sits underneath over here. So I'll just rotate the carb to show you where it is. So this is a pin. So this pin has to align with this slot for this emulsion tube to be held in its correct orientation. So in here, we have a washer that sits in place, and we install the main jet in. So this is the main jet that we are using. It has a number that's 90, which is written on the top, and 90 relates to the hole that's drilled in the center, which is a smaller hole compared to 100 or 110 main jet. So we can vary the amount of fuel that goes through the emulsion tube by using a bigger or smaller jet. So this is the pilot fuel jet. As with all jets, make sure that these holes are not blocked. The pilot fuel jet fits in this tube right next to the main jet. When you tighten these jets in place, do not over tighten them because it's very easy to damage the head of these screws. So next we shall install the float seat. The float seat has a fiber washer that has to be fitted on first, and it's screwed into place. Using a 10 mm socket or a T-spanner, it can be tightened in place. So this is a float valve that's used. In this case, we have a rubber coating on the tip of the float valve, and as you can see, the tip is quite pointed. If the float valve is worn out on the tip, it's going to cause fuel to leak past the valve and overflow in the carburetor. So the float valve sits in the float seat like that. The next piece that goes in is the float. Now the float has an adjustment over here. We'll get back to how to adjust the float height on this. Float sits in here and there is a pin. This pin is inserted through the side and has to line up with the float. It's just pushed into place like that, and the float hinges on it. So this is how we measure the float height. We take a ruler, stick it on the end of the float chamber, and we are looking for around 24 mm between this surface and the top of the float itself. So as we can see, we are around 24 mm, which is the correct setting for this. So this is a spare float that we had laying around. I just wanted to show you how to adjust the float height on this. So we have a tang over here, and as you see, this mark is where it contacts the float valves. So by raising this tab upwards or lowering it down, we can actually manipulate the float height. So next we shall install the float chamber gasket, and this is the gasket. So to install the float chamber gasket, this hole has to line up with the tube in the float chamber and sits in place like that. This is the float bowl. Now in the float bowl we have a tube here, and this is an overflow tube. So in case if the float is jammed and fuel is flowing into the carburetor and it overflows from here and exits through the base here. Now for the choke circuit, this is where the fuel for the choke circuit accumulates. Always make sure that this passage here is unclogged. If there is a blockage in here, you're not going to get fuel filling up this chamber, which then is going to feed fuel to the choke valve. So always make sure that this hole is unclogged. So now we can finally assemble the float bowl. So make sure this indentation fits on the top here. It only fits in one way, and this tube has to fit into this cavity here. So the float bowl is held in by 4 screws, and each screw is held in with a split washer. So it's just a Phillips screw. So the screws that hold the float bowl in place has been all installed and tightened up. So the next component that we're going to install is a slide. The slide has a slot that's cut all the way from the top to the bottom, and this slot has to line up with a pin that sits on the side of this carburetor. If the slide is installed incorrectly, that is, this slot lines up with the pin, what it's going to do is going to hold the slide in the wide open throttle position. So as you start the engine is going to over rev. So now we shall install the slide. So take care, the slot has to line up with the pin that's on the side here. And the slide should go all the way through. And here you can see it's all the way through and it's closed in here. The other point you want to look at is you want to make sure there's no axial play in this slide, so it's not moving around and it's a fairly tight clearance in it. So this is the needle of the carburetor, and the needle has a few slots that are machined into the needle, and this clip can be moved to the top or any of these slots. So by lowering the clip down to the lowest position, we can richen up the mixture, which will allow us to have more power but reduce the fuel economy. Or if we move this clip to the top position, we can lean out the mixture, causing us to have a better fuel economy but less power. So now we shall install the needle into place. So needle goes all the way through, and as the slide goes in, we're going to make sure the needle is actually going through the emulsion tube. So this is a lock for the throttle cable. To install the throttle cable, you slide in the throttle cable through this hole, move it sideways, and then install this lock where the slot lines up here. So this is the top cover for the carburetor, and we have a rubber seal that's supposed to sit in place here. And before we install this, we have to install the spring. So the spring sits in place here, and the cover. So usually if you're installing the throttle cable, you want to install the adjuster nut in place, then slide the rubber through the end of your throttle cable, and that sits as a cover on top. And the cable goes through the spring and is locked into the throttle slide, and it's then screwed into place. The next component that we are installing is the choke plunger. So to install the choke plunger, it just screws into place over here. And it's just lightly tightened with the spanner. The last two components that we are going to install is with the adjustment screw. So this is the throttle slide adjustment screw and it's spring loaded. So install the spring first and it's then screwed into place. So this screw actually adjusts the height of the slide. So if it's wound in, it pushes the slide upwards. So this is a mixture adjustment screw. It has a small spring with it and it's screwed into place here. By adjusting this screw, we can vary the amount of air flowing past this screw. Now finally, we have to install the sealing O-ring that sits in here, and that's just simply pressed into place. So this is a fully built Mikuni VM24 carb that's ready to be used.